give the floor first to Gurminder so that we can continue. But thank you both for your very, very pertinent presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I thought it was a nice overlap in this aspect of the extent to which remembrance of the war is central to thinking about the construction of an identity that's presented as national.
Yeah.
And what that misses is precisely at the point that Britain is fighting these wars. It's not a nation, it's an empire.
Yeah.
And who's fighting the war? Are soldiers from empire? Who's resourcing the war? Is the colonial populations and others and so on. I mean, India, I think, gave. It was a coerced gift of 100 million during the First World War and again during the Second World War. And so and how do we reflect on that?
Yeah.
In the sense that, because I think it really came up in the Brexit debates that the arguments were entirely about how do we reclaim our sovereignty as national? And yet Britain had never been a nation.
Yes.
It had only ever been an empire.
Yeah.
So this is purely a project of construction and projection based on an absolutely inadequate understanding of what our historical past is. And I think that's a real problem, continuing through to the protest this summer with the flags.
Yeah. And it's a huge issue. And I think that, David Edgerton's recent book on post-war Britain was really making this point that Britain really has to, after 1945, consciously and slowly change itself from being an empire into being a sort of conventional European nation state. And you can see that there's still something in the governmental psyche that hasn't quite adjusted to that. It's like someone who's lost a limb and still thinks they can feel their hands. That kind of aspiration to great power status, and you saw that reflected post Brexit in the this global Britain slogan, which was never going to go anywhere.
Well, they call it
because
2.0.
Yeah, exactly, and the idea that the Commonwealth could somehow take over from the EU. But my question for you is, and this is really with my history and policy hat on, and it's a question for me as well. How professional historians can effectively make an intervention in some of these debates, because it seems to me that the right and the right-wing press they like nothing better than a kind of a culture war story. British academic cast aspersions on Remembrance Day, shock horror. The Daily Telegraph, in one of its sort of tabs at the top of the online edition, actually had a kind of culture wars tab, because they run a story like that every day, and you feel that by pushing back, you're almost kind of giving the right what it wants, which is again an excuse to express indignation. So how do we shape that public debate, I suppose?
I mean, for me, it would be about being more honest about the histories that have actually produced us, because Britain as a nation hasn't come to be a nation because of national projects. It's come to be it's had a national project in the context of having been an empire.
Yeah.
That is just the history that has produced Britain.
Yeah.
So what I find extraordinary is how difficult it is for us to be honest about that and to engage with it in the terms in which it happened.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, I don't think it has to be. I absolutely agree. It's been turned into a culture wars issue, where the arguments are then about identity and about sort of pitting people against each other. But we could have an inclusive story, Remembrance Day, which acknowledged the contributions made by all those within Britain at the time, which was the British Empire.
Yeah.
It's the projection forward simply of the nation that's deeply problematic, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Well, the previous meeting we had was in October in Potsdam, Germany, where we were under this same couple of narratives of power. we were discussing Vergangenheitsbewältigung, dealing with your own history in an honest and open manner. And of course, Germany is the country which presents us with the best example of how to do it. Not perfect perhaps, but nevertheless much more than any other country has done. And we can point out to countries such as Russia, which is perhaps the most awful example of how to dealing with history. But we have also discussed this about how do we deal with colonial history. And I would like to ask you both, do you see the concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung as having any relevance in Britain? And has anybody ever tried to introduce it in the same manner?
I mean, it's my sense of it. So I'm not a historian, I'm a historical sociologist, and that puts me in a position where I'm able to sort of look across both history, the social sciences, and so on. And one of the things that's been quite clear in the research that I've done is that historians of Britain often focus on the national frame, and historians of empire look at empire and not necessarily at the nation state of Britain. And what there is very limited work on is the way in which every institution in Britain has actually been funded, supported, and produced through its colonial entanglements. So there's very little recognition of Britain, of the debt it owes to its colonial histories in order to construct the very nation state and institutions that exist in the present. So I think that aspect of looking at the connected histories of empire and colonialism is still a project in the wings, as it were. It's one that I think is desperately needed, because we cannot understand anything about who we are or the shape or development of our institutions here today without understanding it in the context of the histories that have produced it.
I mean, it's maybe a mistake to see Germany as the ideal. And you read Tony Judd's book on post-war Europe. He talks about a project of forgetting in the immediate wake of the Second World War. Certainly in West Germany and in East Germany, a narrative which is about the struggle against fascism, but which really largely ignores anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, well, certainly plays it down. And that it's only kind of from the 90s that you see what emerges now as the more open German approach to its past. And I think empire is quite similar, actually. Until very recently for the British, it was almost too close to it. I mean, when I started my doctoral work in the 1980s as a student, my supervisor was H.M. Coke Green, who was a former Northern Nigerian district officer, turned academic. He was, it wasn't kind of ancient history. And there were plenty of people in the Oxford history faculty, the few who actually took an interest in colonial history, many of them, in one way or another, had been involved in the end of that story. So it's a point, that I think for societies that come, there's a point when you can kind of focus on something as history. But it's often at the point when the people who were alive, who were involved in that, are no longer alive, and it changes into something. And certainly, when I started as an academic, the history of empire was a pretty peripheral thing. Now it's absolutely mainstream, not just to the broader global history, but to the history of the UK itself. So an awful lot has changed, but in a sense, it's changed because we're further away from it, in some senses.
How much is this change also affected by the fact that the demography of the country has changed, and there's an increasing number of people and young students in schools, pupils in schools who come from very different cultures former colonies, and you cannot continue teaching them British colonial history in the same manner to people who have totally different histories.
Yes, no, I mean, that was my experience growing up here, you know, going to school, learning British history, coming back home, telling my dad, oh, you know, it's really wonderful. Today we learned about how the British developed railways in India. And my dad was like, what? You know, it's sort of, so you have these other conversations. And I was horrified at the time. I couldn't believe that my teachers were lying to me in not telling me the full history of what had happened. And I remember that as being quite a profound sort of moment as a child. Sort of, I believed everything school had told me. I loved school. You know, this was where I went to get knowledge and so on. And then when I was trying to explain to my dad, and he was sort of offering me a different account, it's like, well, how do I judge what's true? And I guess that's something that has come up much more over the years then.
It's still very, I mean, it's so contentious though. I mean, a few years, well, what would it be? Would it be early 2000s? There was a British Empire and Commonwealth Museum in Bristol. Do you remember that?
Just about.
Yeah. I think I saw it, and it folded. It must be about 20 years ago. And it was the first attempt to do that. And it's never been, it folded and it's never been revived. And it struck me at the time, sort of looking around it, they didn't quite know what it wanted to do or say. And I don't think anyone with any, you know, who wants to be able to kind of sleep at night in the museum community would want to be responsible for a British Empire Museum in London.
Well, maybe an empire of the decolonisation of
and of course then before that you had, I suppose, you had the Commonwealth Institute in South Kensington, which was the successor in 1962 of the old Imperial Institute, and that sort of conked out in the way that the Commonwealth more generally, I suppose, conked out. But to actually to have a big public museum of empire, it seems to be an obvious gap in the sort of provision of British cultural life. But I think it would be so contentious that it would be very, very difficult to pull off.
But it's interesting how we are committed to remembering contentious histories within Europe, just not the contentious histories that Europe's been outside of Europe. So we don't have a single memorial, statue, remembrance account of the horrors of British colonisation in any way, shape or form. We have plenty of statues to British imperialists.
One idea actually we have had among the Historians Without Borders is trying to bring together historians from former colonial powers and former colonies about how to write the history of colonialism. Because most of it has been done by either the other part or the other part without very much interaction between them. So how much interaction is there actually between historians from other countries in writing the history? Perhaps Europe has shown the example because there's a project of writing European history. I'm not quite sure if it is very successful, but nevertheless, it has brought together German, French, and other historians from continental Europe together to write history. But how much does British historians interact with their colleagues in writing history?
I mean, it's an interesting question because one of the things is that so much of the history that takes place within Britain, I think, does fail to engage with histories that are produced in the colonies in order to inform what it is that they have to say. So if we think about the work that people like Utsa Patnaik and others have done, and she's an economist and a historical economist, and she's looked at the cotton and its contribution to the Industrial Revolution. And one of the arguments that she makes is that every single British historian of the Industrial Revolution and of cotton doesn't ever mention the fact of the way in which cotton was a plant that comes from India. It doesn't grow in Britain, neither in Europe. It's, so how do you have an industrial revolution in Britain based on cotton when the raw product doesn't even come from anywhere close? It comes from India. Yet that link isn't taken seriously. But then also the historians of the revolution do not take into account the sort of 150 years of protectionism that Britain established in order not to allow Indian cotton to come into Britain, in order to allow the indigenous cotton industry to be developed on that basis. And so this is work that has been done by Indian historians for sort of decades, if not longer. But there's a failure of reading by historians in Britain of work that's produced elsewhere. And so you have these two parallel tracks of an imperial history that's written of empire as if without any mention of violence, of dispossession, of extraction, of all the other practices of empire, and those who were at the effect of it, writing the histories of what the effects have been in those places. And so to try and get a history that joins the two together, I think is again vital.
Yeah.
Because the colonized always have to take into account the fact that they were colonized. The colonizers rarely have to account for the fact that they were the colonizers, and it's as a consequence of their colonization that they are who they are in the present. That's just not something that any British historian has to seriously take into account.
And I think you also have to take into account that the historical profession globally reflects global economic inequality. What we in England, in places like this, we complain about budget cuts and student numbers, but basically, we're in a very wealthy city. We have tremendous resources. We have great archives. We have great libraries. We have the economic underpinning of a very rich, intellectual community, a productive community. And a lot of countries around the world that were part of the British Empire can't sustain that. They just can't. Archives are in danger because there aren't the sort of facilities to keep them safe, keep them accessible. So in a way, it becomes almost self-reinforcing, doesn't it?
But then it's even more surprising that the histories that are produced in those contexts are not read either. So it's not as if, a significant number of the historians and other academics from many of the former colonial countries, certainly at least 20 years ago, would often have actually come to Britain to do their PhD researches and so on. And so in that context, they're writing in English, they're often being trained here, they're producing historical work that meets the standards of the British Academy, and yet are still not engaged with. So I think there's a failure of reading by British historians and other academics of work that's produced by people in other places.
Well, I will present one more question before opening the floor to all of you for questions and comments. Namely, I picked up on the word exceptionalism you mentioned, that the British history also writes about British exceptionalism. Usually this is connected with American exceptionalism, where it is a dominant factor. But in fact, I think that almost in every country regards its own history as exceptional.
Yes.
And certainly Finnish historiography also engages in exceptionalism.
No, and absolutely. And I think I was referring to it very much in the context of that sort of narrative, this dominant narrative in Britain of the world wars, of Britain being the country that had to intervene when Europe crashed to save it from tyranny, that Britain stood alone in 1940, and that is certainly a kind of a spirit which animates policymakers in Britain in the 2 decades or so after 1945. That actually Europe, Britain can play perhaps a sort of an encouraging role, but it's not really part of that that broader kind of community of nations, and that it has these kind of, what Churchill called the interlocking circles of the relationship with North America, with the Commonwealth, with Europe, and in a sense has a kind of global responsibility to nurture each, but not to be subsumed by anyone. So yeah, we all have our sort of senses of national exceptionalism, but I think in the European context, it's become particularly dangerous. And again, the question is how one sort of fights back and tries to shape the narrative. Again, another story when the EU referendum took place in 2016, there was a group of historians, small group of right-wing historians called Historians for Britain. And you probably imagine who they were. And so a group of us decided, well, we'll have an alternative group, and we call ourselves Historians for Britain in Europe. And we were sort of taken up. George Osborne, Chancellor, held a kind of a seminar for us in 11 Downing Street, and I went along with my suit and tie on, and I had a photograph taken in front of number 10 Downing Street, and I put it up on Facebook, and I said, we're part of, Historians for Britain in Europe. And my little sister just posted, oh, that'll swing it.
Yeah.
I think you have to be a little bit humble about what you can achieve in terms of.
Anyone now wants to join the discussion with any questions or comments, please? You.
Yes, Marvi Mehman here, Excellency, and the panelists. It was amazing listening to you. My question really is, you have an incredible venue, I think. You're sitting in the midst of a great building, which has all the archives. So I think it's very apt that we're holding it here. Your title is Historians Without Borders. Now, do you think you can actually fill in the current gap that exists within the UN? You are a bit like, to me, you could perhaps be the UN, but not the UN. Do you see what I'm saying? So what the UN is not being able to achieve, since you are without borders, you are one community, can we kind of manage to bridge that gap? And can we get rid of this you versus us and be a bit more, how can I say, inclusive? Because when you look at Historians Without Borders, it means that you're all one community. That's what I'm thinking. That's what I like about this title. So since you're trying to do conflict resolution, do you think you can be a bit inclusive and in the whole approach and contribute?
Well, the next session will concentrate on what Historians Without Borders is about and what we are doing. So I will say the longer answer there. But I will only say that when I have had personally meetings with historians in almost 30 countries, not only in Europe, but also North America, Asia, Africa, everywhere the reception has been very, very positive. And sort of, why hasn't this been done before? And so there is, I think, in the historical community in general, there is a sharing of our views. There may be some differences, obviously, but I don't think that historians want to engage today any longer in history battles with their neighboring countries, which has been the case in history. So the history of historiography is an interesting subject in itself.
I mean, there's another question that comes up in relation to that. It's how the border shapes the way in which we do history, because we've taken the unit of the nation as the natural unit within which history is done to such an extent that we write national histories of entities that were not nations at the time that we're writing these histories. So what does it mean? You know, so I think there needs to be a sort of a consideration also of the histories that get produced through these particular frames and whether the frames are adequate for telling the stories that we want to tell.
I mean, this might be just too obvious a point to make, but I mean, when COVID hit, I was director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies across the way there. And of course, you know, everything shuts down and there's this sort of sense of panic and what we're going to do and just keep things going. And suddenly you realized, hey, there's this thing called Zoom and Teams. And we started to, you know, the Commonwealth itself cancelled its biannual meeting. I think it was going to take place in 2020, and so we rather cheekily held a global Commonwealth academic seminar, and we started got my kind of my global sort of clock out and planned, and we started at 8 a.m. London time with a sort of a group of historians from the Pacific and East Asia, and we worked our way round to the West Indies at 8 o'clock in the evening. And I mean, it actually worked. It worked remarkably well. I mean, it tended to be the people who in London whose connections didn't work very well. But you suddenly become aware, because the big challenge of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, we said with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, but we didn't have funds to kind of fly people around the world or particularly go over there. So suddenly you realize the power of the connections and the discussions that can take place online across borders. And it really, I think it took the COVID crisis to really impress on a lot of us what the potential was for that. And I think we still haven't really exploited it. I think we're in danger of kind of going back to our old ways and old sort of seminar structures and conference structures because we're comfortable with them. But actually we could do far more in terms of, you know, supporting historians around the world and listening to them.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Annie, and I'm from Malaysia originally. I want to say there are a lot of positive things that the British has done, which seems to be not being talked about a lot of the time. So one of them is the book called Sandakan. Sandakan is where I was born and brought up, by the way, part of North Borneo, the main city during the colonial time. That book was written by an Australian writer about the marches of death of the British prisoner of war. It's actually, okay, it is British and Australian, but they were British soldier there trying. So for me, when I was growing up, I thought the British just left during the Second World War, but actually it's not. They were still there trying to fight, and they became prisoners of war, and they suffered tremendously. That book is worth reading. Sandakan, that's the title. And the hospital that I was born in is Hospital Duchess of Kent.
Right.
So I really would like to say that, because that hospital has a plaque telling me it is donation from the people of Britain. So I'm extremely grateful.
Okay.
Yes.
Look at it.
I'd like to say, with the one of the key objectives of Historians Without Borders be to bring about balanced history, true balanced history. You're talking about historians, let's say in Africa, versus and the narratives that is given to their children today, their students, versus the narrative that we have in our history. And of course, you, as academics in that field, you understand and you know the depths of the truth of the truth, let's say, of history.
Mm.
Would you say your objective was to bring about more of a balance on various subjects in history with borders, with historians without borders? So, sorry, I'll just add to that. So
Yeah.
I'm actually a child of the colonial
Yeah.
period. I was born and brought up in Africa.
Yeah.
And what resonates with me is what you were saying, the lessons that I got in primary school even really was just so focused on our side, the British side of what was going on, that it was almost as if the African nation within which we lived didn't exist at all. So I completely understand it. Now, because I've subsequently worked all over Africa and have so many friends, they tell me their narrative, which is what they truly feel. And it's very interesting. As I was asking about the objective.
I mean, it's questions of objectivity and balance, I think, become a little bit difficult, because for me, it's not that there are just two sides to a story and we need to tell both sides of that story. But I think one of the things that we haven't really done is actually think about the broader histories that have produced us. So it's the connection. So I would point more to thinking about whether the narratives that we're being told are sufficient to make sense of who we are and where we are in the context that we find ourselves. So, you know, this aspect that when I get told the British just built railways in India and did wonderful things there, and then I get presented with other evidence around the famines, the extraction, the taxation, and all those sorts of things, then I should be able to put all of that together and come to a better understanding of the histories that have produced. So in that sense, I wouldn't call for balanced histories, but I would argue for more adequate histories, histories that actually make sense of the connections that produce us.
Yeah, adequate is a better word than balance, isn't it? Because it's more correct.
Because I think it also then points to the connections, because balance is almost as if there are these two separate stories that just somehow exist. But actually, anything that exists in its own terms exists in a broader context. And what is the broader context for what it is that we're thinking about? So I think those.
Yeah. And it's about providing, I think, young people with context to understand the world. You look at the world, you can't understand what's going on now without understanding what's happened over the last 100, 200, 300 years, or indeed understand their own country without thinking about those broader connections. So it's giving people a kind of a framework to understand the world better.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Timo Kirmik, and not a historian, I'm a political scientist, professor of international relations at the University of Bath. Thanks very much for your presentations. Very interesting. We have learned from both of the presentations that power affects the way we write history, and that we produce partisan truths when there are partisan powers that support them, and that may be problematic because of the fact that many of the conflicts are born out of intolerance to alternative histories, alternative history, and that's why I think this Historians Without Borders is a fantastic initiative. Yet, I wonder, and my question is whether we would need a bit more courage when we talk about histories that are strongly affected by power. I mean, as you said, both British colonial history became more kind of, it was possible to write about different sides of adequate histories of British colonialism or kind of nationalism only after a few decades. So when you no longer had the powerful defenders of colonial rule, etc. Now, if we then look at what kind of powers do we have now to kind of prevent alternative interpretations in history, I think they're slightly different powers. I mean, do we have histories of the time, for example, do we dare to talk about the history of the way out of Cold War, for example, without becoming kind of banned from everywhere, or do we have courage to talk about Palestinian history the way we would like to, the way the power would not like us to? So should we need more courage to this project of Historians Without Borders?
I mean, well, one thing is perhaps also to slightly push back on the idea that we can only write history perhaps 50 years after it's happened. I mean, if we think about the histories that were being written of British colonization, I mean, Dadabai Noroji, who wrote his book Poverty and Un-British Rule, in London in 1901, he was actually elected as an MP in a constituency in London. He was in the British Parliament. He made arguments for Indian independence through that process. He wrote in English. He published this book in London. And yet, again, it's that question of what are we reading? Who are we reading? Lala Lajpat Rai and others. There's many histories that are being produced all the way through British colonization by Indian historians, economists, and others. The fact that white British historians have been so slow to engage with the colonial violence that's central to British Empire is its own thing, but I think we need to name it and think about that in its own terms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that within the profession, there are very few no-go areas. You can research Palestine and Israel. You can research Northern Ireland, for example. It's when you move from the relatively kind of safe world of academic publishing, journals, university monographs, into the public sphere that things become more difficult. And I think one of the problems is that I think academic historians aren't really trained or particularly well equipped to engage in that policy sphere. And I think we need to, I suppose, my unit, History and Policy, tries to provide a kind of a platform from which, historians can engage with policymakers over historical issues, sometimes quite contentious historical issues, in a way that is safe for both parties, in which both parties don't feel kind of compromised by it. But it is very difficult. I mean, and I think at the moment, doing public history around Israel and Palestine is incredibly difficult. And I think it's and more difficult in many other countries than this one. So we have to think about the frameworks for those debates, creating sort of safe spaces for those discussions.
Elisa.
Yes, I had Historians Without Borders had a couple of months back in Helsinki another discussion where the case of Germany was mentioned, or the German way of doing his remembrance of the past and dealing with history, that it has been a very state-centered project, a very state-centered and sort of up and down history project. So here the way you explain about these colonial histories, and what we know is that it has emerged more as a, if not countering the power or the state narrative, so at least as an alternative to it. So I'm thinking in terms of public policy or public history, what are the risks of that it has this alternative project background at least? Is there a risk that then it becomes very polarized and not taken seriously? Or is there a possibility that to bring it more through policy discussion to public history to change history books? So do you see at this moment this more sort of academic and perhaps bottom-up process of history writing compared to Germany as a benefit, or is it too risky at this moment?
Well, I think there's a dialogue. So I'm not sure what you're wanting to identify as the risks, but when you've got grassroots history writing, if we want to say it in those terms, it's often by people, groups, populations, communities who don't find themselves represented in history with a capital H. So this idea that there's a particular historical narrative that gets presented and people sort of say, we can see this also as women. When women entered the academy in greater numbers, one of the things that they found was that their experiences and them as women were very rarely represented within the histories of the nation or within the sociologies of the family or work and so on. And so not only were women missing, but the inclusion of women into those narratives also changed the narratives that we told. And I think that was the point that you were raising earlier about the changing demography of many European countries as people from other parts of the former empire came to Britain in much greater numbers. As they engaged with history and discovered that these histories were told in very particular ways, there was a wish to make arguments that also reinserted other narratives, other histories within them. Much of that work was often done outside of the university or outside of the academic space, because the university itself is a very particular sort of institution and it takes a lot of work to become part of it. But I think that as much as we can draw on the community histories, we also need to challenge the idea of history with a capital H and ensure that these other histories come to be part of that, so that history for all of us is transformed. Relating to that with what's happening in Germany, there's become a sort of solidification of a particular narrative of what the history has been and what the political consequences of that history are, such that there's no space now for anybody to engage with that, to think about how these things develop. And I think that there is no final story ever to be written about our past. It's always a dialogue. It's always a conversation, and we have to have the spaces within which we can have those conversations, but also be clear that there are standards as to what constitutes history. We cannot just make stuff up.
No, I was just thinking that it wasn't in this particular context because of the political tool.
Yeah.
So you want to have these colonial histories, and then this is something we don't want because you have the national history in terms of school books and so on.
I think what's difficult in the English case or the British case is that the British government, as I've said briefly earlier on, I think has been quite reluctant to actively shape a given historical narrative. The first time there was a national curriculum in the UK was only in 1989. And that was the first time there was any sort of debate within government around the sort of history that should be taught at school. And it was that the recommendations came from a sort of a panel of historians and teachers. It was all very kind of arm's length. And subsequent interventions by there's been a certain amount of posturing by government ministers over the last 35 years around this. But the academic funding is still done on an arm's length basis by the research councils. British government doesn't get involved, and some of the kind of key works of popular history, therefore, have been done by organisations like the BBC or by the independent broadcasting authorities, or by things like the British Legion, so that you kind of have an informal sector shaping the popular debate, and sometimes shaping it in quite, as I suggested in my presentation, in ways that could be seen as quite damaging or quite restricting. But it's not as though you're kind of fighting against a government diktat. you're dealing with a kind of a broader kind of range of unofficial organizations often. And that makes engagement all the more difficult, I think.
Okay, and the last question before the coffee break from Jukka Korte.
Okay, thank you. As Elisa, I'm also a member of our board of the Historians Without Borders, but I'm also a historian, more particularly social science historian. Social psychologist Michael Billig introduced this idea of banal nationalism in 1990s. And what you, Professor Murphy, talked about, it's more or less this kind of banal national commemorations, these poppy campaigns, and memorials, etc. And it's quite evident that in certain historical situations, such as Brexit, this kind of banal nationalism rises. And the same way I see when you showed the picture of Spice Girls. The 1990s was also the rise of Britpop and Tony Blair and that kind of stuff. But I'm interested compared with this 90s and the Brexit to the first Britpop boom in the 1960s and especially in 1966 when England won the World Cup in football. So that I understood that was the first wave of this rise of new patriotism here in Great Britain after the Second World War. So have you studied that? How things, and especially this imperial heritage, how was it shown back then in this kind of a context of banal nationalism? Because sports is particularly a really good example of that kind of banal nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. It's such a huge question. I think one of the interesting things about
these puppy campaigns, but there are also that kind of campaigns back then.
I mean, one of the interesting things about 60s popular culture, I think, is the way it sort of ironized the British Empire. You know, the kind of Carnaby Street, Sergeant Pepper crowd, you were kind of using Viceroy's uniforms as a sort of ironic cosplay. And there was a sense that somehow, the British had just suddenly outgrown this strange sort of collective fantasy of empire, at least in some quarters. In the sort of the more radical popular culture. And on the other side, you still had right-wing members of the Conservative Party forming the Monday Club. And even, in the 70s, sort of right-wing fanatics starting, private armies, talking about coups against the government, the so-called Wilson plot of the 1970s. So you already have a sort of a kind of an elite right-wing backlash in the 60s and 70s, which is perhaps slightly obscured by the sort of Sergeant Pepper, So already you see quite deep cleavages in British society, and particularly in the sort of establishment, over how empire should or might be remembered.
I think there's a couple of things that we also need to disentangle, because in the 60s, Britain still has an empire. And some of that empire is beginning to come to Britain in increasing numbers. So I think the public discourse also shifts from empire to questions around multiculturalism, or what they called at the time coloured immigration. And so the emergence of racism as a problem within British society is something that comes up at that time. So I think empire has less valence, except it's the place from which people are coming, but they're coming here and they're not wanted here because they're not seen to have been part of the nation historically. I mean, And it's quite interesting because at least up until the 70s, Britain was a country of emigration more than it was of immigration. So Britons are still moving to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, elsewhere at the time that Commonwealth migration is increasing into Britain. But the discourse internally is about the problem, as it is today, is about the problem that migrants bring as opposed to the solutions that they provide to the country in that sort of time. So I think there's an interesting place of when empire and colonial histories actually come to dominate the public debate, which is much more recently, and certainly not as much when Britain was part of empire, although there were things like Empire Day. So there may not have been British Day. And you're saying that Remembrance Day is the closest, but there actually was an Empire Day, which then became a Commonwealth Day.
Called Commonwealth Day in 1958.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So,
well, thank you very much for this. I regretted to mention at the beginning that Cathy Ashton was supposed to join us a few days before the event. She was indicated that she would be ready to join us, but unfortunately the cold caught up with her and she had to cancel her appearance. But we are very grateful and we hope that she will be in some future events also participating. So now we have about 50 minutes for a coffee break and refreshments, and we will continue at 4 p.m. Thank you.
Thank
2
you.
p.m.